Grigsby, we are back at it. We're doing the King Project. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to talk with you and discuss a little bit of Dr. King and his great work and legacy. And it's just been a great pleasure, and I really appreciate you guys' support. All right, let's jump in right into the quote. Today's quote is this: lightning makes no sound until it strikes. Lightning makes no sound until it strikes. This quote is going to be backed up with a discussion in regards to the time period of his funeral. Dr. King, as we all know, had his untimely death on April 4th, 1968, where he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. After Dr. King was shot and killed, he was taken from St. Joseph Hospital to R.S. Lewis Funeral Home, where he was provided services. Ironically, the person that was providing services had just met Dr. King for the first time a few days before that. Imagine that. Coretta Scott King was flown in the next following day with the help and the facilitation of Robert Kennedy, helping that for her to get to where she needed to be. She had made a decision for Dr. King for his memorial service in Memphis, Tennessee, that she was going to have an open casket. I believe she done this for a number of reasons. A few were just, having closure for the family, giving an opportunity for the family to kind of really see that Dr. King wasn't coming home. He had 4 children, and he was in a situation where he was their leader. And I'm sure it was something very hard for them to grasp. And Coretta Scott King did a great job in being able to start helping that process for her home family. I think another reason she did it was for acknowledgement of Dr. King and the trauma they sustained, and the tragedy that we had going on in our U.S. history. Ultimately, Dr. King was taken from the funeral home and transported to the airport by the National Guard, the same National Guard that was involved in the sanitation workers' strike and all the violence and all the chaos that went down. They had some involvement with that, with Mayor Lowe bringing them in. So, like I said, for this particular time period, it was very ominous, vexing, self-serving. There was limited cooperation. But Dr. King and his family, I believe, still were able to have that triumphant level of legacy. Once he was transported from the airport in Memphis, Tennessee to Atlanta, they had 2 funeral processions for Dr. King, a private one and a public one. The private one consisted of about, I believe, 1,300 people, and that was mostly family members, labor leaders, and 40 dignitaries that were flown in that really supported Dr. King and some of the great things that he was doing. I didn't see any evidence of any major U.S. Figures involved with this first funeral, the private one. I do know that this funeral was on April 9th, and the president at the time acknowledged Dr. King's death on the National Day of Mourning on April 7th. So, 3 days after he was assassinated. Dr. King's family also decided to have open casket, I believe, during this time period. So for the second funeral, what they did after the first one was have him really go on a 3-mile journey from Ebenezer Church to Morehouse College, where he was an alma mater. Now, what I didn't understand was, in some ways, was that Dr. King, with some of his controversy, I believe, and some of the direction that he was going into, the only involvement that he really had from our government and everything like that was, again, transportation of his body for the National Guard from Memphis, Tennessee, hospital, funeral home to the airport. And then even now for the second funeral, again, there was 100,000 people there in attendance in mourning. And the only involvement that the Atlanta police had, or anyone, was really transportation and transporting the foreign dignitaries and some of the official people that were involved with the funeral. So very, very limited, if you will. And like I said, to really take the responsibility of 100,000 people in mourning, that was on the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, his group, his only founding movement group that he was involved with. Dr. King was still able to prevail. A brilliant decision by his wife, Coretta Scott King. She allowed him to do his own eulogy, if you will, and it was really based off of a speech that he gave 2 months prior to the date of his assassination, called the Drum Major Instinct sermon that he gave. And within this, he had talked about his death. He had talked about, you know, a lot of different things. And to me, in my mind, this sermon that was allowed to be done at the eulogy was his real official last speech. You know, he's getting credit for this last speech of, I mentioned, the mountaintop that had happened the day before his killing. But, you know, really, the way that Coretta Scott King handled his funeral and his funeral proceedings, this was his last official one, and it was a brilliant one because he really talked about and really slammed home the fact that he did not want any mention of any of his medals or honorary degrees. I mean, he received over 50 honorary degrees from college universities. In his lifetime, he had about 300 or 400, you know, acknowledgement awards such as Nobel Peace Prize, the American Liberties Medallion, and some of these great things that he did. One thing I would like to mention, though, is Dr. King did not receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom until, I believe, 7 years after his death, and his wife had to kind of accept that on his behalf. And the sitting president, Lyndon Johnson, did not acknowledge him for that award. But to give you perspective, he did acknowledge Helen Keller in 1964 while she was still alive for that same award. So, you know, like I said, I know he had worked with President Johnson quite a bit. I believe they had a working relationship. I believe they respected each other. But at the same time, he was not acknowledged for, you know, something that I believe he was about. I mean, he had over 100,000 people at his funeral. That's just a great representation of his influence and his influence on freedom throughout his whole career. And Dr. King, in this eulogy that he gave from the speech that he gave 2 months prior to the day of his death, goes like this. And this is just a small quote that I want to give to you. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. So even in death, even in passing, Dr. King was a brilliant person, rhetorician, and brilliant person to be able to kind of really prevail, if you will, in a lot of ways. And he was able to prevail, in my mind, at his own funeral. Even though it was very painful and a very tough decision, I believe that that decision was the best decision that Coretta Scott King could make to give Dr. King a triumphant legacy on the last word. This is Chuck Grigsby, GUND Worldwide. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you guys some of Dr. King's great legacy. We got a whole month long of October to share with you some of his great work. And I appreciate you guys supporting us. And I appreciate you guys giving us an opportunity to share some of this great stuff. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.